Hey everyone out there, Dan here, aka the Comic Concierge, and today I'm doing a special video as we're seeing the popularity increase for characters like Invincible due to the Prime show, as well as The Boys with their TV show now in 2 seasons, and then most recently for Netflix, they released Jupiter Legacy. We're seeing a plethora of superhero stories being told outside the confines of the Marvel and DC universes. And it had me thinking, what are some other superhero stories that exist that are not within those universes? And really, if you look at TV and film, they're having a similar trajectory that comics did. For a long time, superheroes were dominated by Marvel and DC, but eventually, as time went on, we got other superhero stories that kind of deconstructed a lot of the classic tropes we were seeing for generations, and now we're seeing that again with television movies, but that timeline has been sped up a bit. So with that in mind, I thought I'd talk about other superheroes that exist outside of the world of DC and Marvel, and talk about some comics I would recommend, not necessarily ones that all have TV shows or movies, although some have some coming. But if you've been enjoying those TV shows and you want to read more of that content or more things that don't have to fit into a certain bubble, these are some recommendations. And I thought I'd actually go back, way back to the time well before we had Marvel and DC, to some superheroes that existed before those universes. And when we talk about superheroes, we often think that Superman was the person that kicked it all off. The Action Comics #1 started the superhero genre, and of course that book did wonders for the comic book medium. However, superheroes were existing before then. Most would claim the first superhero was in fact the Phantom. The Phantom was created by Lee Falk and first debuted in his own newspaper comic strip in February 17th, 1936. It recounted the adventures of Kit Walker, who donned the mask and purple outfit to become the Phantom, aka the Ghost Who Walks. Unfortunately, many years later, we also got a follow-up film based upon that comic strip starring the iconic Billy Zane, although that is one of those movies we try to pretend doesn't exist. Now, no disrespect to anyone who enjoys that movie. In fact, unfortunately, I've actually never read any Phantom comics. It's just a gigantic blind spot for me. However, I have seen the Phantom movie. Hey, I was a kid. I don't know what I was doing. I don't remember much of it. I actually just remember not liking it even as a kid. Maybe I'll go back and my mind will be changed. So if you're a person that has read a lot of Phantom comics and would like to recommend them, definitely let me know. And there's a ton of them, of course, because he's been around for some time. But there are other characters outside of the Phantom that certainly have had some impact on the superhero genre that are a little bit more present in today's comics. And when you talk about superheroes, it's a little bit difficult to explain who exactly qualifies as a superhero. For example, you have a character like the Shadow. And the Shadow existed really before comics, first in things like pulp novels and radio dramas. There was even a radio drama that was voiced by Orson Welles. But is he a superhero, or is he just kind of a crime fighter? And maybe it's a combination of both. We do know the Shadow did greatly inspire a lot of superheroes we see today, especially the most popular superhero of all time, Batman. In fact, recently Dynamite had a crossover with Batman and the Shadow, I think paying homage to this idea. I did read that book. I liked it. It was a nice just seeing two worlds, two different time periods come together into one book. And I think it's a good introductory to that character and a good way to have Batman kind of give the rub to Shadow for a character that I think is really responsible for his growth in popularity. And if you're a person that maybe was interested in the Shadow, it's a good book I would recommend. Despite my lack of experience with those characters, I did feel like I did need to bring them up because they have played such an important role into the world of superheroes, both those in Marvel and DC. And if I'm going to be talking about superheroes and those that exist outside of the well-known universes, I felt like I could not do that without at least giving them a quick mention. And then you also have characters like the Spirit that was created by Will Eisner. The Spirit I do have a little bit more experience with, actually very much thanks to a recent gift I was received by Damien, aka Sleepy Reader, who's a great YouTube channel. I would highly advise checking that out. He mailed me a bunch of Spirit comics because I was talking about it, I don't even know when, and I've been really enjoying those. I actually have future videos where I'll be diving into the Spirit, and I've read more recent ones done by Darwin Cook. And again, the Spirit, is he a superhero? Is he more of a crime fighter? Again, your mileage may vary, but I do think he does follow into that general vein, similar to like the Lone Ranger, for example. No superpowers, but a guy who puts on a mask to fight crime, to me, is the definition of a superhero. But maybe others may disagree, I'd be interested in knowing the comment section down below. So if you did want to read more about the Spirit, I would highly recommend checking out the books that were done by Darwin Cook. It's a great entry point into the world of the Spirit with amazing Darwin Cook art. And one of the best parts of Darwin Cook's art is that it has a timeless quality to it. It holds up today. It could also hold up 100 years ago. So you get a feeling that you're reading something that is of today, but with a style that is very much homage of what Will Eisner did when he first created the character. The last character I wanted to bring up that fits into this series is the Green Hornet. And I actually remember watching old Green Hornet reruns back on FX or one of those channels when it was first starting and enjoying it, of course, getting Green Hornet and his sidekick Kato that really did everything. And then we had that movie done by Seth Rogen not too long ago, which was okay. Actually realized it's a decade ago that came out. And it had its moments. It's, again, one of those movies that has been lost in the ether. It's not awful. It's not bad. It's just kind of mediocre. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because of the recent series done by Dynamite that was written by Scott Lobdell with art by Anthony Marquez. And so if you are a fan of the character or you wanted to dive into that world, it's a good entry point into it, in large part due to the art of Anthony Marquez, who has a lot of similar qualities to someone like Darwin Cook, a very timeless style that he has. It was almost in a black and white, very simplistic in its nature, but as you realize, there's actually a lot of smart choices on the story side, especially one of my favorite panels of the year thus far. You have this scene that they're all getting shot at, and in order to showcase the amount of bullets that are coming at them, you just get one page with them small on the page and then a ton of just sound effects to showcase the bullets that are coming their way. I thought it was very clever, very well done, and I think Taylor Esposito was the letterer on that, and he just went to town and was one of my favorite moments of any comic I've read thus far. It's a series that I think I've heard no one at all talk about, but I think it's one that if you want like old school, old style storytelling with characters like this, the characters that would be in the old noir superhero genre, it's a good one to pick up. So when you're talking about superheroes that exist outside of the world of Marvel and DC, or superheroes that deconstruct the genre, it's hard not to talk about Watchmen, right? I mean, it's the most popular graphic novel of all time, maybe the most popular superhero story of all time, at least the most acclaimed. And I'm not going to go wax poetic about Watchmen. People know about it. I think that deserves its own video, or generally it's been talked to death at this point. However, if you like Watchmen and you want something that is tangentially related to it, I would highly advise reading the Peter Cannon Thunderbolt series from 2019. This is written by Kieran Gillian with art by Casper Wingard, and it's in the spirit of the Watchmen. For those that don't know, the character Peter Cannon doesn't exist inside of Watchmen. However, Ozymandias, the main, protagonist, antagonist, depending upon your point of view, in Watchmen, is very much inspired by this character. He's kind of the smartest man to ever walk the world, basically. And this series is odd, to say the least. It's hard to kind of explain it, put it into context. I will just say it does everything possible to break the rules of the world of comics. It changes genres, it changes styles. Casper Wingard put on a clinic with this book. Even the letterer as well, because you have handwritten lettering at one point, because you have them kind of traversing different dimensions. In each dimension, there's a different type of style, a different genre within comics. And I think it took the idea of how Watchmen deconstructed the world of superheroes and took it one step further to deconstruct comics in general. And it's a fascinating read. It's a captivating read. There's nothing else quite like it. It's one of these things where you're like, who cares about the character of Peter Cannon? Why would anyone even spend time to write a series like that? And it's taking a character that, again, has some notoriety, at least has some history, and doing something that's completely unique and original with it. So again, if you like Watchmen, it's not tonally very similar to that. It doesn't necessarily have the same level of craftsmanship. It's a different type of craftsmanship. But if you just like seeing people take on the medium of comics and do fun or original things with them, it's one I would definitely advise you checking out. Let's switch gears a bit in the sense of, with Watchmen, you have this deconstruction of characters that has a very cynical tone with nihilistic characters that makes you kind of wonder why you would ever read a superhero story. And then you get something like Astro City that is very much, I would say, the opposite of that. Now, Astro City is not necessarily overt celebration of superhero characters, but I think it is definitely less cynical in its approach. I think there's a more genuine love of the genre that is apparent throughout, although it does add additional depth. And Astro City first came out in 1995. It's written by Kurt Busiek. It's been going for some time. Technically, I think it's still going, although it's stopped doing monthly series about a few years ago, which is a shame. And Astro City is the city of superheroes, and it's had a lot of different stories throughout, and it's actually been through a lot of different publishers. The first issue of Astro City is actually one of my all-time favorite single issues. It focused on the character of the Samaritan, and he's almost like an analog to Superman, and the first issue is just kind of getting insight into who he is, and he has these dreams of basically just enjoying peace and quiet in a way, and you just see how the responsibility of being who he is kind of weighs on him, because he can't have a moment of peace, because if he does, horrible things can happen. It's that classic line of being, great power comes great responsibility from Spider-Man, emphasized through this single issue. And the good thing about Astro City is the fact that you can pretty much pick up any trade, any single issue, and for the most part understand it. You have a lot of self-contained stories within the self-contained universe, but if you're going to pick up one trade or one area, I'd advise you to focus on would be the second trade, which was Confession, and it focuses on this sidekick who is the sidekick of this character, the Confessor, and he's trying to kind of live up to the responsibility of that role, but he learns a dark secret about the character that kind of sets everything in motion. And it's interesting reading Astro City because you do feel like it hit a lot of storylines before a lot of other Marvel and DC hit storylines. For example, there's a storyline that feels very similar to that of Secret Invasion or Civil War. And I don't know if it was just serendipitous or what happened, but eventually, those stories did end up in the pages of Marvel. But it has a very old school feel. Like if you know Kurt Busiek, he's one of the most well-regarded superhero writers or comic book writers of all time. Of course, he wrote the series Marvels, which actually is still going today. And it has that sense, I think, the romantic sense of the superhero genre. Although, it's not necessarily an overt celebration of the characters all the time. It just, I think, is a celebration of that type of storytelling through and through. It's one of those books that makes you realize it's okay to love comics. It's okay to love superheroes. And a lot of the characters are pretty much analogs for characters that but not all the time. Sometimes there are original characters. And what's also great about Astro City is that you often get storylines that are through the eyes of normal citizens. And one of my favorites was actually one near the end where you had this guy who was married to this woman, but because time travel and things happened and it's caused history to change, the person that he was married and loved to no longer existed in history. And he ended up running this grief counseling session, and you get kind of a conversation between, does that equal loss, the same way of losing someone, really, like in the sense of seeing someone killed or something like that. And it was just an interesting way of kind of showing the repercussions of the actions of superheroes, that even good come bad. And I think that's one thing Astro City did really well, is give you a complete picture. You weren't always focusing on certain characters. You had a lot of, important characters within it, but the scope was quite large. So the hard part with Astro City, though, is that it's a bit hard to find because it has switched publishers a lot. There are a lot of complete sets out there. That you can pick up, or just different graphic novels. Some of the stuff isn't in print, but most of it is available digitally if you want to check it out that way. Or, you never know when it'll be reprinted again. But if you can find any of it, I think it's really worth your time. Along the same lines of Astro City, you have something a little bit more recent, and that's Black Hammer. And the Black Hammer reviews started a few years ago, established by Jeff Lemire and Dean Ormsted. And it started off as a single series about these heroes that find themselves in this random town and they're stuck. And they don't know how to get out of it. They don't necessarily have their powers anymore. And they're just trying to escape, but they're not sure what exactly is going on. That was kind of the central mystery of it. Similar to things like Watchmen and similar to things like Astro City, I do think it is, can qualify as a bit of a deconstruction of the superhero genre, because you see these individuals kind of broken down to their exact core. And there's certainly more problematic elements to who they are, but I don't think it's nearly as cynical or nihilistic as something like Watchmen. I think it rides the line. Certainly there's a level of melancholy, there's a level of kind of extreme drama at times, but I think at the end of the day, these are generally good people, just with maybe problematic elements or challenges that they face. And I think that is indicated throughout the entire run of both Black Hammer and a lot of the miniseries. Most recently, one of my favorite comics of the year thus far, Barbarian Red Planet, was an perfect example of that, because Barbarian, is clearly an analog for something like the Martian Manhunter, but a difference between him is that he is gay, he's homosexual, and making it even more complicated is the fact that even his home planet doesn't accept him. So he's coming from two worlds. He's being backed by two worlds that see him as an outsider. And Barbarian Red Planet did touch upon a lot of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. And that's something I think was very different from the world of Black Hammer, because a lot of it didn't necessarily have that same level of social commentary, but this one did. And there are a plethora of Black Hammer miniseries that are out there, some better than others. Most of them I have really liked. I really think they all have their own unique flavor. Dr. Tomorrow, for example, is kind of like a Starman series, and I thought that one, similar to Barbarian, had such an emotional core to it because you had this father-son story. Then you have something that is a bit different, like the Colonel Weird series, that just looked phenomenal. You had Tyler Cook art doing Black Hammer, so that looked fantastic. You have something like Black Hammer 45, which was Black Hammer during World War II. It had that serial sensibility with art by Matt Kent and written by Ray Fox, and I really like that series. I know a lot of people seem to be down on that a little bit, but I'm a fan of Matt Kent art, and I love that style, that where it didn't necessarily feel like it was deconstructing that genre or adding to it. It just felt like it was very much within that world. One of the benefits of the Black Hammer series is that whether you're reading the main series or the spin-offs, most of them are self-contained, and you don't necessarily need to read anything else. The Black Hammer single book, the actual main storyline, though, I do think you do need to read it from beginning to end. You get the second part of it, which is like the Age of Doom. You can't really read that by itself. You need to kind of read it in order. But the side books, like the Barbarian Red Planet book, if you'd ever read anything Black Hammer, I think you'd still really like it because it's very much its own story. So what's really great about Black Hammer too is just the consistency of it, and you're surprised it could be as good as it is as often as it is. Like, I've never read a Black Hammer book and actively disliked it. Although there was one issue of the Black Hammer Visions book which I was not super keen on, I can still recognize and say it wasn't an awful book. And it's interesting, as Astro City kind of went away, this came up and kind of took its place. And again, I feel like people forgot Astro City didn't exist. I will say, if you love Black Hammer, you like that world, Astro City is right there for you to read. If you loved Astro City, and I think Black Hammer you'd enjoy that as well. I will say too that Black Hammer feels much more in the vein of DC. So if you're a huge DC fan and maybe you're not enjoying what they're doing, maybe check this out, especially like old school DC, Silver Age type of era. There was even a DC crossover with Justice League, which was pretty good. Again, nothing great, but if you want to see those worlds combined, that's another book I would recommend checking out. Now, let's shift over again to a book that's very different from Astro City and Black Hammer, and that's Kick-Ass, written by Mark Millar with art by John Romita Jr. And this book has been around from some time. There's actually been a lot of different spin-offs now. Hit Girl is its own series, and it's continuing to go today. Although I think it still was at its best when it first came out. And I know there are a lot of fans, people that don't love John Romita Jr.'s art, and I kind of get that. Sometimes it can be a bit sloppy, but I think it definitely worked with Kick-Ass. And I will say, I think I like Kick-Ass a lot more when I first read it compared to when I'm reading it now, because there's some problematic elements. There's some things that don't age well. I mean, MySpace plays a major role in that book, but again, if you do like something that is akin to The Boys or that look, of course, new Kick-Ass has come out as a movie as well. But again, I feel like it's one that's been a bit forgotten because so much has come out since then. And if you have enjoyed Kick-Ass, and maybe you enjoyed the comic as well, do know there have been additional comic series that have come out, different versions of Kick-Ass and Hit Girl, different crossovers. And the thing with the more recent Kick-Ass and Hit Girl series is that it is written by different creators and with different artists, so maybe that's something you would enjoy. It's a bit weird seeing different creators take on Kick-Ass and Hit Girl, but sometimes it can lead to better things in a way. I mean, even Kevin Smith did an issue not too long ago. There have been actually an additional Kick-Ass character, so if you're trying to pick up the most recent series and you're like, did Kick-Ass change? He did. So maybe go back and read the introduction of her. I did think that was one of the better examples of kind of continuing this story, because you have this woman who was a soldier taking on the mantra of Kick-Ass, and it's a way, I think, of continuing the series moving forward, and her interaction with Hit Girl has actually been kind of fun. So this does feel like a joke that maybe went on too long, but if you enjoy it, if that's the type of flavor that hits you in the right way, there's actually plenty of books out there for you to read. I talked about with this how it's kind of difficult to qualify what exactly makes up a superhero, and I debated about including this character, but I feel like you kind of have to in a way, and that's Hellboy. Now, Hellboy, again, is a character created by Mike Mignola, who's been around for some time. And does he qualify as a superhero? Is he a mythic character? Like, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a combination of all those things, but I think ultimately, although he doesn't have tights or anything like that, I still would qualify Hellboy as a superhero. And you got to also just be impressed by the longevity of the character. He's been around for such a long time and is continuing to be around today. There's been so many different series, and a lot of them, of course, were done by Mike Mignola. Other series were done by other creators, but you have, again, another massive, expansive universe with a ton of creators and characters outside of the main line. If you want something that is, I think, much more akin to a superhero story, I think that's where the BPRD books come in, because you do have more of a team-like atmosphere, and there are a ton of BPRD books, a lot of different takes on the character, all taking place in different times and places. And one of the benefits of those is that you can kind of read them by themselves. You don't necessarily have to read them in order. You can even read the BPRD books without even reading the original Hellboy series. And the original Hellboy books, I think, of course, are fantastic. But it is interesting seeing how that character has evolved throughout the years. It's just bound to happen when you have a character around as long as they are. Of course, we have the Hellboy movies, and I've not watched the most recent Hellboy movie. I just saw it was lambasted by critics and lost interest. But I will say that the movies aren't necessarily the same flavor as the books per se. The books have a much more gothic feel, where the movies do feel more like regular superhero movies, although good. Like, I do think Hellboy Golden Army is quite a good movie. Of course, it's Guillermo del Toro doing it. But when it comes to my experience with Hellboy, I've read a good amount, not necessarily everything. There's a ton out there. Right now, we do have actually a young Hellboy series that's out, and I think that's actually a good lead-in point to the character, because again, it's something that you don't necessarily need to read anything else before. It's taking place before a lot of the main Hellboy stories began, so you don't have a lot of connecting details. And it's been a fun adventure book taking place in this like dangerous island. And again, the thing with Hellboy is that you can kind of pick it up at any time. If you like the shows like Supernatural, for example, that you have these crime investigators taking on different things, and that show went on forever, I think there's a lot of similarities with that, with something like Hellboy, but dealing with more characters that are actually part of the occult. And it deals a lot with classic fairy tales, classic horror stories that have been existing throughout different generations, through different cultures. So if that's another piece you enjoy, just learning that, you can check out Hellboy. It's, again, a book that it's one of the most influential comic series that have existed, kind of helped define Dark Horse. Like, without it, I don't know if Dark Horse would be even existing right now. So, and a lot of it too is available on Comixology Unlimited. If you wanted to get a little bit of taste, get some experience with the character, that may be the best place for you to go. When you look at the history of superheroes, especially the earlier characters, you'll see one key factor, and that's the fact that most of them look like me, and the fact that they're Caucasian, they're white. You barely got any black characters, let alone black superheroes, which is where I think a comic like Black comes in. That it's about a world in which superheroes exist, but superheroes are only black people. Despite the fact that they are superheroes, they still have to live in the underground. And there's even a recent series, a new series that's coming out, that is expanding upon this world called White. I think that's going to add to the social commentary, and clearly this is a pointed social commentary. It's not shying away from that fact. I know when it came out, it was a bit controversial, which I think is a bit ridiculous, because if you read it, you can see that it's making a lot of good points. In fact, the first issue, I think, did a good job of explaining things like community policing and how important those are, as it led to an individual being shot to death that really shouldn't have been. But after he's shot, he awakes to find out he has superpowers, and he finds this entire world exists that he did not know about. So I would highly advise checking this out. I know most of these are available digital, and with that new series coming out, I don't know if the new series, because I've not read it yet, I know it's going to be hard to find, because I do think there was limitations on how many were printed, but hopefully it'll be available digitally or something like that. But it is one of those books I felt like did kind of go under the radar a bit. It made a big splash when it was first created, but people kind of after that didn't talk about it nearly enough. And it's a book that I think, beyond the controversy, was just a generally good story that had important things to say and important things that people should definitely hear. This again falls into the category of, is this a superhero? Is this not a superhero? I don't know. I'm going to call everyone a superhero at this moment in time, but one of my favorite characters of all time, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I, like many of my age group, did grow up with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, especially the cartoon. And when that came out, I had no idea they even existed as comics. Like, I didn't know that was a thing. I've read a little bit of the early comic books done by the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and those are good if you can find them. Of course, you're gonna have to find them in trades or reprints because the originals are quite expensive. I will say though, if you are a fan of the original cartoon or any of the cartoons, the IDW series that's been going on for some time now is fantastic. It's very much in that vein, but I feel like it's much better in the sense of it adds a lot to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle lore. It has this element of reincarnation to the characters, so things make a bit more sense of why these turtles would have the powers that they do, have the abilities that they do, along with with Splinter and things like that. And you get a lot of the characters, things like Casey Jones, the Shredder. But in reality, the world has greatly expanded beyond that. There have been new characters. It's been one of the most consistent runs of any publisher over some time. And you don't see a lot of comics, let alone indie comics, going beyond the 100 comic mark, which they have done. Geekcast Radio, which I've done a lot of work with and still do, they have a plethora of content that covers the TMNT universe. I'd highly advise checking that out if you're interested in it. But I do say, like, you can't necessarily pick up any volume and understand it. I do think you just want to continue it with issue 1 and issue 1 volume. And again, a lot of them are available on Comixology Unlimited if you're interested. It's a good place to read. That's where I read most of them myself. I will say there have been like different spin-offs and things like that, which haven't been as good. I will say the one spin-off I did really enjoy was Shredder and Hell. That was one, it was a beautiful looking book. It looked fantastic. And just seeing Shredder kind of take on demons, it gets into his history as a character as well. That one I would recommend. There's also a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Urban Legend series that's going on right now. And that is a bit weird because it has a long history where it was a series that was going on in the 90s and got canceled. And then it came back and now it's continuing. It's very different than your typical Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's wacky and weird. I wouldn't say wacky. It's actually kind of dark and twisted in a way. So if you want a different take on the Turtles that is outside of the IW series, that's the main title, that's another one I would recommend picking up. I wasn't a huge fan of it personally. I knew a lot of people do enjoy it, but it just didn't hit my sensibilities. I just preferred the other way the Turtles were approached. But if you want something that is different than that, that may be more up your alley. I've been talking a lot about Comixology Unlimited because it's a great place if you wanted to pick out some of these books. They even have a Comixology original that falls into the superhero genre, and that's Youth, that came out last year, and actually we're getting the second volume this year. Although I don't know if I'd call these characters superheroes because they're kind of awful at times and do really bad things. If you saw that movie Chronicle that came out a few years ago, starring Michael B. Jordan, and it was kind of a found footage superhero story, it's very similar to that. These kids get their powers because something coming from space, and they don't necessarily know what to do with it. Imagine the X-Men without Professor X. They have all the teenage angst, and now they have superpowers. So what can that lead to? And often it's very bad things. The second volume has just recently started, and it's been quite good as well. It's called Badlands, and if you know the movie Badlands, and it's kind of in the same vein. It's actually kind of funny seeing them take on that storyline, but then add in superpowers, and it's actually quite working. So I know the art style may not work for everyone. If you read that book Olympia, it's done by the same team, and one I would recommend checking out. And it's an easy one to kind of jump in on. It's very quick read, but I really enjoyed a lot of the characters, and I am finding it more impressive the way they're kind of expanding this universe with the second volume. The last superheroes I'm going to talk about that exist outside of the Marvel and DC universe is an entirely publisher. So in a way, I feel like I can probably do another video all on Valiant and Valiant Comics. And Valiant existed in the 90s for some time, but like many, it died as the speculator bubble burst, but it came back in 2012. And when it came back, I think a lot of people were hesitant to think, well, can this really last? And it has now, 9 years later. And I think it's lasted because, again, it's not necessarily about speculation. It was about telling good stories with great creators. And who are some of the characters in the Valiant universe? And I think it's something that's different with Valiant compared to Black Hammer or Astro City, is that you don't necessarily have a A to B comparison. It's not like you have a Superman character per se. You have someone like Bloodshot, and Bloodshot is kind of like an amalgamation of Wolverine and the Terminator and Punisher all in one. But with that, we've had really good Bloodshot comics, including Jeff Lemire's run, which is highly underrated. Personal experience with Valiant Comics started with the miniseries The Valiant, which was an early crossover of a bunch of different characters, kind of like the event comics you get with Marvel. And as someone who was going into it, was just interested in seeing all these different characters that I knew very little about all in one, but I thought it did a good job of getting me understanding of who they were. So if you're looking for a starting point, that would be one I would recommend because it was successful for me. I would also highly recommend Jeff Lemire's run on the character of Bloodshot. It went for some time. There were different miniseries, especially when you had Bloodshot lose his nanites and he kind of became a normal person in that storyline. You even got a storyline with Bloodshot in the future. The scope of Lemire's run was pretty impressive. You also have characters like Exo Man of War. I really love Matt Kent's run on that character, and he wrote that character for some time and recently just ended about last year or so. And Exo Man of War, I guess, kind of combining characters. He's like Captain America and Thor in a way. He was a Visigoth who was abducted by aliens and came back and found out that his world has completely changed. He has this suit that gives him all of his powers, basically, and the mythos of the suit has changed. Now it's become its own kind of being in a way. You also have Ninjak, who's very much like a ninja, Archer and Armstrong, which are this odd couple of, of like this immortal drunk with this kid who grew up in a cult, and they become friends. Then you have more fun series like Quantum and Woody, and I feel like you can pretty much pick up any Quantum and Woody series and enjoy it. They're this odd couple that they kind of hate each other, but they become superpowered friends. You have Quantum, who takes everything very seriously, where Woody is more your brash, very arrogant type of character. Although, if there is one series I would recommend outside of them all, is actually the Secret Weapon series. And I love this book. It was one of the best comics of the year it came out. It's about these characters that, they don't have the X-Men. They have these things called the Harbingers, these people that have powers that are innate within them that they have to try to unearth. And not all those powers are always that great, which is the Secret Weapons storyline, where you have people that the powers don't seem all that powerful. You have a girl who talks to birds or something like that. A guy who can summon objects, but he doesn't have any control over what it is. But the way it really utilized those characters, though, I thought was impressive and had fantastic artwork. And the best thing about that series is that you don't need to read anything else. It's self-contained. It's all by itself. You also have characters like Livewire, who had her own series that spun out of the Harbinger Wars 2 storyline. That one I think is pretty good, although it does tie much into that crossover as well. You then have characters like Shadow Man. Shadow Man just recently started a new series a few months ago, and that's been pretty welcoming. It does tie in, I think, a bit to some older series, so it may not be the best jumping on point, but the Valiant universe is very expansive. They tend to not have a lot of comics coming out all at once. They tend to have, one or two series, and then they'll switch characters, so you don't necessarily get an Exo Man of War series from beginning to end, or Archer and Armstrong. They tend to take turns, but also makes it very easy to kind of catch up with characters in that way. And another benefit is the fact that the majority of their first volumes are only $10. And again, a lot of those are available digitally as well. They do have crossovers as well, which I think the benefit of that, it does make it feel like one complete universe. The downside is that, again, crossovers, people don't love them. They're not done as often, and they're a little easier to follow. I'll probably do another video where I'll dive a little bit deeper. So I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version. So be on the lookout for that. But I'm curious, if you are a Valiant fan, what are some books you would recommend, or what are some characters that you would recommend people check out? Of course, there are plenty of other superhero stories that exist outside of Marvel and DC I could have brought up. You have Irredeemable, Incorruptible that Mark Waid did for Boom Studios. I've not read a lot of those, so I didn't feel like I was apt in talking about them. And of course, I didn't talk about Invincible. I didn't talk about The Boys, and I didn't talk about Jupiter's Legacy. Again, because those are already out there. People know about them. My hope was to shine a light on some other books that you may enjoy, especially if you enjoy those TV shows, that these might be ones you want to check out. And let me know what you're interested in. Let me know other superheroes that you enjoy that are outside of the comic book universes like Marvel and DC. You have, of course, classic characters like Spawn. Again, I didn't talk about Spawn all that much because I'm sorry, I could never get into Spawn. I tried. It just didn't necessarily strike me all that well. But if you are a Spawn fan, what are good starting points for him? What are some good storylines that maybe change my viewpoint of the character? I'd love to know in the comment section below. But ultimately, thank you for checking out my channel. I really do appreciate it. Just remember, comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, keep reading.